Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your daily sit rep for Friday, the 23rd of January, 2026. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Big thanks to Jared and Robert for filling in again while I was out. This may end up happening for like the next couple weeks, and then we'll be back to normal. All right, Robert. Good morning. There you go. Hey, listen, I see lots of people in the chat. It's like -4, -35 in northern Minnesota this morning. It's -3 wherever Bill is, et cetera, et cetera. You're down in Florida. What's it, 80 degrees?
It's down in the 70s right now.
Oh, gosh. All right, break out the jackets. All right. Well, at any rate, Robert, good morning. Let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway here.
Good morning, Mike. So the House passed their final package of must-pass spending bills yesterday. This includes the Health and Human Services, Defense spending, Labor Department, but also Homeland Security spending. And Democrats did cross the aisle to pass that Homeland Security funding bill. So this, I think, makes a shutdown on the 31st of January unlikely. Democrats did pass the aisle, and there is some disagreement now from the Democratic, Socialist, and Progressive factions of the party, because both Democrat and Republican leadership have been doing whatever they can to stop a potential shutdown at the end of the month. I think a big part of this is also Congress. Both parties are concerned over being sidelined by the Trump administration, so they're trying to demonstrate that they do have power of the purse in Congress.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, let's move on to Minnesota, because there are a few things there's actually a lot of things that happened yesterday. There were some arrests made, and I think we're starting there.
Yeah, so there were arrests. 3 demonstrators were arrested as part of that St. Paul church demonstration that happened on Sunday. One of those was William Kelly, who is allegedly involved in some anti-ICE activity in Washington, D.C., and then 2 local activists, Nakima Levy Armstrong and Chantel Louisa Allen, and they were all charged with conspiracy against rights. I think what's going on here is that the Trump administration is taking some pieces off the board for the anti-ICE movement in Minneapolis, especially with Allen and Armstrong, because they are longtime Minnesota activists and connected to the DFL, or the Democrat Farmer Labor Party. They're also leveraging this conspiracy against rights, which is what Douglas Mackey was charged with, and other conservatives during the Biden administration. So they are now using this leverage over these anti-ICE activists. And we could see, I think, if they continue these types of demonstrations where they're going to churches, they're going to be more of these conspiracy against rights charges.
Mm-hmm. You know, Robert, I'm seeing a lot of people, even on the left, saying, yeah, maybe we shouldn't go in and disrupt Christian worship services. Now, of course, not everyone on the left is saying that, but it does seem like there's been a fair amount of blowback, especially on the indivisible side, because those are still fairly establishment, mainstream, left-wing activists, obviously, but it seems like even they were saying, like, well, maybe we should not go and violate federal law. Being that, well, let's just back up 1 second. So this is what, two arrests for that church disruption?
3.
Okay, 3. All right. And has Don Lemon been arrested yet?
No, and actually yesterday, a magistrate judge in Minnesota decline to approve those federal charges against Don Lemon. And he's saying because he was media covering the protest. Somebody that's familiar with what the DOJ is planning to do said that they could find other avenues to charge him other than this specific avenue through a local judge. Mm-hmm. So it looks like there is a potential plan to charge him through another avenue.
Okay. So, well, I guess my point is, there have been 3 arrests. There were, how many dozens of people it was a large group in that church. And I can see the case to be made, and I maybe have seen some Trump administration officials say this: throw the book at these people, charge them maximally under federal law as a deterrent for this type of activity in the future. And do you think that's going to work?
I think that's what they're trying to do. And I think a large part of that is to deter people from moving from casual protester to activist, showing that they will get these charges levied against them. And I think they're using the FACE Act violations and these conspiracy against rights charges. I think the intent here is to move these cases out of the state and local courts into federal courts, because there have been cases where some anti-ICE activists have been charged for assault or other violations during these anti-ICE activities and federal surges where they have been either the charges have been dropped or they've been acquitted. And I think the point here is to move this to federal courts where the Trump administration thinks they have a better chance of winning a conviction.
Mhm. All right. Well, let's go ahead and move on. There may be a couple other things for Minnesota, right?
Yeah, well, yeah. Today is the beginning of that economic blackout day of action, and there are so far more than 300 Minnesota local businesses that plan to close today as part of that day of action.
Mhm. And then that's so these economic boycotts, they've had these for the past couple of years now, or at least 1 year, and they have not been very effective. I think maybe there was one case. Do you remember the Target? I think one of those was the Target boycott when Target started removing all the LGBTQ whatever stuff out of the front of their stores or out of the front of many stores. They were targeted for a boycott from the left over their removal of those items, and they have not seemed to me like they've amounted to a hill of beans. Is there any reason why this is going to be any different?
Well, I don't think this is going to be an effective economic boycott. I think what it's going to do is add capacity to protest this weekend because there's also support coming from the school board employees in Minneapolis and St. Paul for this, and then some of the businesses that are staying open said that they're going to donate the revenue they make today to some of these anti-ICE and pro-immigration groups. So there's going to be a little bit of capacity expansion for protests and demonstrations over the weekend. I think that's
Mhm,
going to be the main effect.
mhm. Well, and just briefly, this looks like to me it could be what's called a structure test when these left wing organizers, and typically we're talking about unionization of the workplace here, but they'll go in and they'll try to unionize a workplace. Now, remember, union officials cannot enter the shop floor. They cannot go in the business. So what they do is they train organizers who then go get jobs at these facilities, like an Amazon warehouse. That's happened a lot to Amazon. It's called salting, and these union organizers, the people who are trained to do this, we'll just call them cadre. They'll go in, they'll get a job specifically at this place where they're trying to unionize and work there. And one of the things they start doing is when they start building this movement, they start recruiting people, finding people who are on the left who want to join or who want to unionize or democratic socialists or whatever. They have these things called structure tests, and it is a way for them to basically gauge the size of their movement and the commitment level of their movement. And maybe it's something small like wearing a button. All right, on Friday, we're all going to wear this button. And if you don't, if people wear the button, there's going to be this visible signature of people who support our cause. And then if people who say they support our cause show up and they're not wearing the button, then we can't count on them to do much greater things in the future. And so all this economic blackout stuff, it seems to me, maybe like dipping the toe in the water, finding out who's on board with taking higher levels of risk in the future. And it does seem to me like this is momentum building. I mean, this is maybe a structure test for their movement. And it's another reason why we should 100% should be expecting higher risk action in the future. Robert?
Yeah, I agree, and if I remember correctly, back during the 2020 riots in Minneapolis, there were businesses that there was one famous case where a guy defended his own business and was effectively politically persecuted for it. So I imagine that there will be some of these businesses that are saying they're going to close or doing it to avoid some of this backlash.
Mhm. All right. Anything else for Minnesota?
No.
All right. Well, I'll let you take it away from Chicago then.
So over in Chicago, a jury acquitted Juan Espinoza Martinez. He was accused of putting a bounty on CBP and ICE officials. The jury deliberated for fewer than 4 hours, and according to his defense attorney, he sent the message with the bounty to his brother and an acquaintance who worked as a government informant, and that he was, quote, spreading neighborhood gossip. I think combined with this and some of these other legal developments, including the district courts over the last year putting national injunctions and TROs on the Trump administration for clearly political reasons, some of these local juries and judges that are refusing to convict and prosecute some of these cases, I think we're looking at a significant deterioration of effectively the rule of law in the United States. And I expect a lot of this to continue, especially with these activist groups that are doing jury nullification training. And then also in Chicago, a far left group called 1312 Anti-Fascist published a lookbook of hostile media. In this lookbook, they include Nick Shirley and independent journalists Andy Ngo and Nick Sorter. And there were they did say in this notice they called for activists and far left militants to not give interviews and also to treat them as antagonistic. And this was published on one of the far left blog sites, but was later taken down once it got attention. And then finally, the Federal Emergency Management Agency is predicting a severe winter storm this weekend across the eastern United States. And they're warning of high winds that could damage infrastructure and hinder some emergency responses.
All right. Thanks for that. And by the way, we someone mentioned HEB, which is a Texas grocery store chain. And yeah, my HEB was in the process of being cleared out here. There you go. All right. Lots of folks getting ready. Well, Robert, that's not something that you really have to worry about. But Jared, good morning. You're in Ohio. You definitely do. You're not too concerned about it, it seems.
No, we're not getting a whole bunch of ice. We're probably going to get a whole bunch of snow, but it's over the weekend. I'll just bundle up a bit more. It'll be all good.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and start here with the Board of Peace.
All right. So Board of Peace was a big announcement yesterday. Finally got through all of it. There are 25, or there's the U.S. and 25 additional members as initial signatories. And Trump said that the board is going to serve initially for the Israel-Gaza conflict, but eventually serve as an international peacemaking body for other conflicts as well. He did specifically call out the Russia-Ukraine conflict, so I think that's going to be his next milestone here. Now, last night, President Trump actually revoked Canada's invitation to the board as well, but he did not explain why. We will get into what I think the reason is. Now, the United Nations was founded, quoting, to prevent conflict, helping parties in conflict make peace, deploying peacekeepers, and creating the conditions to allow peace to hold and flourish. For 3 of the 4 of those, the Board of Peace will have an overlapping mission. So when taking into context the exclusion of Canada, which is on the back end of their strategic partnership announcement with China, and also the call for the middle power poll that we covered earlier this week, I think the United States is building a competing body to the United Nations, and this is going to intentionally exclude nations who go against the United States. Moving on down to Costa Rica, the United States announced sanctions on 5 Costa Rican nationals and 5 Costa Rican entities for money laundering and trafficking cocaine. The Treasury Department says that 2 of the designees have actually been using maritime routes to smuggle Colombian cocaine into Costa Rica. So this is part of that ongoing effort to actually dry up the source of cocaine down there in Latin America, and really get toward ending the drug war. Going way far south, the United States conducted its first Antarctic treaty inspection since February of 2020, and this is in preparation for a consultative meeting in May. Now, these inspections are actually there to ensure that adversary nations such as Russia and China are not violating the Antarctic Treaty, which doesn't allow for mining, it doesn't allow for military activity, amongst a few other things, but the military activity, I think, is the big one. Now, this is the 16th inspection since 1963. It's not unheard of, but it happens once every 4 years normally, and they took almost 6 years to do. That's 150%, or sorry, that's a 50% deviation from the norm. And I do think that we've actually been tracking this mission over on forwardobserver.com via our ship tracker, because we've been tracking Operation Deep Freeze from one of the Polar Stars. Now, that ship class specifically, we've been talking about it extensively because our lack of icebreakers is a security risk for the Arctic, but also for our ability to secure the Antarctic as well from adversary nations like Russia and China. Moving over to Asia, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Elbridge Colby is going to visit South Korea next week. Now, South Korean anonymous sources claim that he's going to discuss the nuclear-powered submarine deal that is ongoing, and wartime operational control transfer for the forces that are in South Korea. We've been discussing those for quite a while. This is important because Colby is basically the mastermind behind Pacific readiness for the Department of Defense, Department of War. So whatever comes out of these meetings, I am going to take exceptional note of. And lastly, there's been a lot of hubbub about the European Union and European powers shifting away from the United States in favor of China. Well, the EU as a body readopted several pro-Taiwan stances, including um, declaring the stability of the Taiwan Strait to be of vital importance to the EU, and not just kind of taking a neutral stance, but outright condemning China's use of UN Resolution 2758, and that's the one that shifted international recognition from from Taiwan to China, and no longer permits Taiwan to even actually have a representation in the United Nations, and it's what gave China its UN Security Council seat. This is big. Basically, the EU is either going to have to recant this stance if they want to get in China's good graces in order to actually counterbalance the United States, or they're going to just be pigeonholed back into coming back to the United States and have to deal with worse deals because as President Trump said during his speech, if you go against us, we will remember.
Jared, there's been a lot of talk, especially about Greenland and Denmark and the future of EU or European relations with China. We just saw where over the earlier this week, French President Emmanuel Macron over in Davos at the World Economic Forum said, we want more Chinese investment. We want the Chinese to come in here and invest in France. And there's been some talk about the EU pivoting away, basically a hard pivot against the United States towards China. And I think this was back in 2016, 2017. The Chinese, a gaggle of Chinese economic and diplomatic officials approached the EU and said, make us your primary trade partner away from the United States. And basically it was supposed to, or is intended to be this large economic and diplomatic coup where China steals Europe from the U.S. sphere of influence, or at least from the U.S. alliances. And the EU said, no, thanks. We're going to stick with the United States. There's been a lot of talk about whether President Trump's, I don't know, you call it bull in a China shop approach to not just Greenland, but trade in general and in relations with the EU. Is this a sign that the EU is still firmly in the camp of the United States, or is that a bad read?
So I won't say they're firmly in there. I do think that they intend to counterbalance the United States with China, but they have structural issues with even moving toward that, being that they are an avowed democracy of sorts. They intend to maintain democracies around the world. Even Mark Carney calling for that middle power pole. What he's doing there is trying to say, hell yeah, we'll maintain he's shifting from rules-based international order to values-based international order, placing more emphasis on democracy. So while they may want to go to China, they would then have to sacrifice the Chinese democracy for that. So whether or not they will actually be able to do that, I don't think so. The one almost neutral path they could take is maybe buddy up with China a bit more on trade and investment, though that will be a national security issue for each one. But at the same time, commit to additional troop commitments to Taiwan wherever they can. Now that really only limits it to like the UK, France, and Italy, because they're the ones with navies that can reach there. But I mean, they're going to be in a tough spot. I don't think they can fully switch to China unless they just completely go away from their sacred democracy.
Mm. One other question or follow up here about this Board of Peace thing. Back in 2022, I believe it was, Chinese President Xi Jinping launched the GSI, the Global Security Initiative. And that was, at the time we talked about it in great detail. It looked like Xi Jinping was launching an international cooperative to rival something like the United Nations, or kind of rival these Western-backed or Western-led international organizations. Not to replace the UN, but to build an institution where the pillar of power, where the source of power and influence was in China, not in Europe, and certainly not heavily swayed by the United States. Do you think Trump coming out and announcing this Board of Peace is not necessarily a response to the global security initiative, but maybe a response to something that's being done in advance of the United States pulling out of the United Nations, or doing something similar to China's GSI, where we build an institution that is more heavily anchored to the United States than the UN would be.
I do think this is more in response to the United Nations than it is the Chinese organizations, which I'd actually like to just throw that all under the Global Governance Initiative that was announced last year, because really they all fall under their sub initiatives. But neither side, I don't think either side will fully leave the United Nations until it's just a hollowed out husk, which it's already kind of ineffective. But the first one to leave has to cede authority to the other one in that body. And I don't think either one is willing to be the first mover on that. But creating competing organizations, it's almost kind of like something that Robert and I have talked about before, where in the EU system they form coalitions after a vote, and in the American systems you see coalitions formed before a vote, and it's run under two parties. It almost seems like the international organizations are going to be split in an American style system, where you have predetermined votes, you get up, you vote, and then it's deadlocked and we're at a 50-50 again. When comparing the GGI to like the Board of Peace and anything else that President Trump is going to put out.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would note that the United States has now officially exited the World Health Organization, and probably a sign of things to come. Really, as people have been talking about this multipolar world for at least a decade now. Even going back to the Obama administration, there was that picture of him reading Fareed Zakaria's book, The Post-American World. And there was this big expectation that Obama was going to gracefully lead the decline of the United States. And so this is a big long-term strategic issue that we've been talking about. But with the United States withdrawing from the WHO and from the climate agreement under the first administration and so on and so forth, it really does. I think we can clearly see these lines breaking down, the international spheres of influence breaking into 2 or 3 major spheres. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. We'll come back to this because we do have some questions and comments to get to. But first, pitch back over to Robert for the Homeland Ops brief.
So some Minnesota activists in a group called ICE Out of Twin Ports released a call to action for activists and protesters to de-arrest people detained by ICE in Minneapolis. They also published a de-arrest guide on social media illustrating some of these de-arrest techniques that we have seen, because there have been attempts to de-arrest people who have been detained by ICE for either impeding ICE or illegal aliens in Chicago. There were videos that were released of multiple attempts. Also saw some de-arrest attempts in Charlotte during Operation Charlotte's Web. I think this is part of this viral moment strategy that the Trump resistance has been engaging in for roughly the last year. This includes videos where local officials were going to court, immigration courts, and trying to impede ICE detentions by demanding to see warrants. And I think the point of spreading some of these videos was effectively what is mimetic capacity expansion, convincing casual protesters, I think especially, that they can attempt de-arrests without any kind of repercussions. Because they have also, in addition to spreading those videos, there have been these zines that have been put out with these types of de-arrest guides. I think the intent here is for this to be a force multiplier for the anti-ICE movement and the Trump resistance, as more people think they can effectively de-arrest both activists and illegal aliens without any kind of legal response from the Trump administration.
Go ahead.
And moving over to Arizona, there was an interview yesterday with Arizona Attorney General Chris Mays, where she said Arizona residents who shoot ICE agents who are not, quote, identified as law enforcement could be covered by Arizona's stand your ground laws. This was a very interesting interview because the reporter who was interviewing her tried multiple times during this interview to get her to walk back some of her statements, specifically asking her that you're not, or you're to just to make sure you're not advocating for people to shoot ICE agents. She would say, yes, I'm not saying you should shoot ICE agents, but she would then start to double down on this statement. And one of the quotes that I think was important here is that she said, if you're being attacked by someone who is not identified as a peace officer, how do you know? And then she said, I'm a gun owner and I can't tell whether they're a police officer. What am I supposed to do? I think this is important in the context that she started the interview by saying that ICE are not real law enforcement, and that her office, and then she made some other statements that are important here, like that they are going to prosecute ICE agents for breaking state law, and that she thinks they are preparing a surge into Phoenix, Arizona this week or going into next week. This is, again, this mimetic capacity expansion thing. She denied the implications of her statement, but I think this is increasing the risk that we do see violent confrontation with ICE and CBP agents, because I don't think it is a realistic argument that the anti-ICE activists are unaware that they are confronting federal law enforcement, because they'll claim that they're not identifying themselves. They're not wearing masks. Some of the statements she makes, like ICE isn't real law enforcement, real cops don't wear masks, etc. The anti-ICE groups, rapid response groups, and activists are well aware that they are dealing with federal law enforcement. But I think the point here is that the most important point here is that this increases the risk of a violent confrontation from someone who does listen to Attorney General Mays saying they are going to protect activists, and thinking that means, well, I'm going to have legal protections if I shoot an ICE agent. And we've already seen in the last year 3 deliberate attacks on ICE and CBP personnel. The 2 attacks, or 3 attacks in Texas, and there has been, during some of these rapid response operations in these federal surges, violence against ICE and CBP, throwing objects, frozen water bottles, rocks. I think this is increasing the risk that we see one of these people who've come out in the last couple of weeks, these activists who are arming up for like in Minneapolis, that there is an increased risk of a confrontation that ends in violence.
Well, this is the first stand your ground law that Democrats have actually liked, apparently. Number one. Number two, it does seem like this is almost tacit, not necessarily approval, but maybe like tacit approval, basically implying or intimating that if something like that were to happen, yeah, like you said, Robert, maybe you would be charged, which is it's very concerning. Also, I want to ask you this question because I've been on Facebook because we've had these, like, my little, local piddly protests. I live in a deep red county, and just right outside of Austin. And so there've been these small protests, and I've been getting on Facebook and following the local left-wing community organizer pages and in the accounts, and of course news accounts. And I've been pretty amazed at how many people in my own town have been anti-ICE. On Monday, we had some ICE agents in town making arrests of, these people were felons, of illegal aliens who had committed felonies, or at least charged or been convicted of felonies, the worst of the worst. And there was a huge backlash about even those people being arrested. So, number one, for those of you out there who are maybe concerned about this kind of stuff happening, hop on Facebook or news outlets and go see what your local people are saying and see what the sentiment is. So, at any rate, Robert, one of the things that I read in those comments is what you said. Yeah, ICE is not real law enforcement. Well, hang on. ICE agents are graduates of FLETC, which is the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, and they absolutely do have the authority to intervene or to stop criminals who are committing felonies. Robert, I'm not an attorney. I'm not well-versed in a lot of this stuff. Maybe I probably should be. And I'll ask some ICE agents that I know. But my question to you is, what is the response? What is the legal authoritative response to people who say ICE agents are not law enforcement?
Well, they are credentialed law enforcement. I believe they are under the federal civilian employment. Effectively, their version of MOSs or military occupational specialties. They're 1811 special agents. They are credentialed.
Mhm.
But I have seen, this is something I've even seen locally here with people that I know that are the more left wing persuasion or liberal persuasion, that this meme of ICE are not real law enforcement agents has caught on. I think that's deliberate. There's a deliberate messaging strategy. And I think the intent of that is to get more of these people that are, open to doing these protests as casual protesters out to do these protests and get them started on that protester to activist pipeline, with the expectation that that they are legally covered in a way that if they do disrupt or impede ICE operations, well, they're not real police. They can't arrest me. I think a lot of people in Minneapolis right now and some of these other federal surges are finding out, well, that's not true. But with the messaging strategy, that doesn't really matter, because what most people are hearing is from Democrat officials is that ICE are not real cops, but they're not really hearing about the arrests of people that are doing direct actions or otherwise trying to impede ICE operations. And I think that was deliberate, just like these other viral moment strategies.
Mm-hmm. So much of what we talked about regarding color revolutions, especially, but also the Trump administration, is about legitimacy and this concept of legitimacy. Things that are illegitimate tend to be replaced or are more likely to be replaced over time, whether that's through revolution or like if you have an illegitimate government, and governments that are legitimate tend to stick around. Let's back up just 1 second. Legitimacy is the recognized right of the people for any authority to be in charge. Okay, President Trump was elected. He won the Electoral College. He won the popular vote. He's a legitimate president. If we had a president who stole an election and declared himself president, that he would be an illegitimate president. And then you would have justification or maybe even casus belli to resist or to try to remove or depose this illegitimate leader of this country, this illegitimate authority. And this is the same process that the color revolution uses. We have to delegitimize this president or this ruler or dictator, whoever, so that we can overthrow him. And it sure seems like there is a concerted effort, Robert, like you said, to delegitimize ICE in order to do the same. We've seen calls to abolish ICE. We've seen calls to resist ICE. They're not real law enforcement. They're X, Y, or Z. And it really does seem like this is an emerging theme here, in that if these people are successful in delegitimizing ICE, then they will necessarily legitimize potentially armed resistance. So at any rate, and there's a couple of questions. Let's just go ahead and get to this comment or question right here. There's one about, let's see. Sorry, guys. There's a question about if something like this were to happen in Arizona, where you have this AG base maybe given a tacit acknowledgement that if you're approached by ICE, then they don't identify as law enforcement, then potentially you could shoot them in self-defense. Okay, that's just basically what the AG said in so many words. The question from B-Ski 1611 is, would that kick off an internal shooting war? One of the things that we've seen in Maine, and what other city was it? There was a right-wing or conservative group that went out to counter-demonstrate against some anti-ICE activists who were demonstrating against ICE. Do you remember where that was, Robert?
Recently, that was Portland. That was the demonstration outside that ICE employee's house.
Mm-hmm. Portland. I think we can all recognize that the temperature has been turned up significantly over the past roughly month, but really a couple weeks now. Was that shooting in Minneapolis 2 weeks ago, Robert? 2 weeks ago today, I think. Yeah. All right. So whenever we're talking about a breakout of conflict, like if I'm looking at this, let's just say as an intelligence analyst, and I'm trying to say, okay, when does this thing actually turn into an active conflict? Or when do we turn the corner? When do we advance to actually organized political violence. And I think heretofore we have seen obviously mob style violence, but that is not the same as organized political violence. Organized political violence is when you have a group of people coming together and there's a coordinated effort. And typically this is armed political violence. Okay, so this is using guns. This is not just, hey, let's go out and throw rocks and frozen water bottles at cops. Even though you could say, in my mind, that's more mob style violence than organized political violence, but maybe you could make the case that it's both. But it's certainly very low level organized political violence. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about here would cross into an active, basically insurgent, like a legitimate insurgent type behavior. And so when we look at this, we're looking really at three factors. We have our fault lines. Okay, so these are the tectonic plates that shift against each other. These are the rifts in society, or these social cleavages, and it could be religion, it could be politics, race or ethnicity, socioeconomics, class, whatever. Okay, those are all we all know about those things. These are the things that separate American society. I mean, these are tears in the fabric of American society, and that's in order to get a conflict, you have to have something like that. You have to have some form of grievance, and the larger those rifts are, the deeper those fault lines are, the greater the potential you have for conflict. And then we have the second factor is accelerators. And if you have a pot of water on a stove and you turn up the heat, you're going to start seeing little bubbles form. That water is going to get really hot. And we have been in the acceleration phase so far this year, or for the past year plus. As of right now, we're obviously still in the acceleration phase, but this is where the water's heating up and it starts to get to a low boil. And then that pot of water cannot boil over until it reaches a certain temperature. And that water is really churning. And then that's when you get that trigger event. And one of the questions that we talked about a couple Fridays ago was whether this shooting in Minneapolis was a trigger event. And there was some other event last year, and people were talking about, oh, this is it. Like, this is the kickoff. And I said, no, I don't think we've seen enough acceleration. The water's not hot enough yet to boil over. The question is, the water's is much hotter today than it was a year ago. Is the water hot enough to boil over? And that's a difficult question to answer. I would still tend to say no, but Robert, the question is, if we actually do have a shooting like this, where an ICE agent or maybe multiple ICE agents are injured, and this could be in a case of quote unquote self-defense. It could be an ambush kind of thing. We have seen ambushes against law enforcement as well, like that bad one in Dallas some years ago. Is that going to be a trigger event? And I would tend to say, and again, we obviously cannot define the specifics, but I would tend to say, yeah, that could actually be a trigger event for organized political violence. And I think you would see a response, not just at the federal level, but maybe on the right wing as well. And the real problem, there's obviously a lot of problems with that, but one of the problems is once you get into this spiral where one side justifies their action because something that the other side did, and then the other side justifies their action because of the thing that the other side just did, that spiral is how national conflict, that's how low intensity conflicts begin, and the armed parts of low intensity conflict. And they are so difficult to stop. They are so difficult to stop once that takes over. And I would say we're like on the tail end of orange, probably looking at red. How do you break down that situation, Robert?
Yeah, I think there is there is a potential for something like this to be a trigger for the right in the United States, because there's a perception that the Trump administration is not effectively addressing some of this violence, because there have been violent incidents targeting just people on the street in Minneapolis that activists said that were potentially undercover ICE agents. There was that incident we talked about earlier in the week with those tech workers in that cafe. There have been some of these journalists on the ground, independent journalists in Minneapolis have been attacked by activists and protesters. I think there is a perception that the Trump administration is not doing enough, and that is increasing the chance that there would be a right-wing organized political response to something like this. If somebody were to interpret the implication here from the Arizona Attorney General that they would be legally covered if they did shoot at ICE agents, I think that would be a trigger for right wing response.
Mm-hmm. And this would almost come down to, yeah, it's not necessarily that there's a power vacuum, but I've seen, and I know X is not real life, but I look at X as almost as a temperature gauge. I don't think it accurately reflects the mood of the country, but at least the communities that I'm in, I think it accurately takes the temperature of at least one part of the right. And there is Nayib Bukele has talked about this. Lots of people have talked about this, about the issue of the judges. And then we had this judge in Minneapolis fail to sign the complaint or whatever, basically issue an arrest warrant against Don Lemon. And there is a legitimacy issue there. And I think a lot of people on the right say, well, these judges, they're not even enforcing the law. They're allowing these repeat offenders, a 17-time convicted whatever guy out in Charlotte, North Carolina, just letting these people, these criminals, these violent criminals back out of prison. And there absolutely is a legitimacy issue that has developed where a lot of these judges are just no longer seen as legitimate by a part of the country. And so that again says to me, when there is an issue of illegitimacy, the likelihood of conflict goes way up. Because if you have a problem that is caused by someone or a group of people who lack legitimacy, the logical conclusion is that you have to have a legitimate solution. And when that legitimate solution is not being done at the state level, then you have non-state actors pursuing what they think is a legitimate solution. So it is very concerning all around. Robert, I'll give you the last word and then we'll move on.
Well, and I think this is one of the things the Trump administration has had a problem with over the last year's messaging. Even President Trump has said this on a lot of what they have been doing. I think that there is a danger of that here, where for the last almost week, the DOJ said they were going to make arrests for this church protest, and they kind of let that drag on. And I think that this is the lack of messaging or this messaging failure is giving the perception that they are not capable of, or they, for whatever reason, whether it's local, state level, political and legal resistance or illegal resistance, that they're not capable of tamping down on what I think a lot of people on the right see as disorder. And that is not only, I think, making a right-wing political response, organized political response more likely, but also a lot of this is breaking containment from the right-wing online sphere and being absorbed by normal conservatives. I think there's a potential it starts to radicalize more, for lack of a better term, normie conservatives that will then get into, feed into some of the right-wing organized response if there is a trigger event like this.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, what's much more to follow? And here's what I'm going to do over the weekend, being stuck inside due to the ice storm. I'm going to go back and pull out some of my doctrinal intelligence materials and look back through some stuff and flip through some of those pages and see if we can't get a better job of a better tool to size up the situation, because it is, people say it's concerning. It's obviously concerning. But I really do think, and let me also just say this real quick. Back in 2024, I was telling people the last half of 2024, I said, look, the far left is not going to riot if Trump wins. There will not be a 2022.0 in 2025 because there was not enough pressure built up in the system. We had not seen enough acceleration. We have not seen enough accelerators of conflict in that middle phase. And a year, 2 years later, we are seeing a lot more acceleration now. And I will tell you, if there's one more event like that shooting, and listen, it doesn't matter which side you're on, whether you think it was a good shoot or a bad shoot, it was a shoot. If we have another one of those, I think that could actually be a trigger for something far worse. I'm going to try to size that up a little bit better for you over the weekend and have something for you early next week. But I think that's where we are. I mean, I think it's pretty much time to say, in terms of low intensity conflict, I'm not talking about 1861. There's not going to be a Russia-Ukraine fought here in the United States, at least not anytime soon. But in terms of an actual armed domestic conflict, I really do. I think we're getting much closer. And it's not a prediction other than to say if there's another shooting involving ICE, that may be a point of no return. You know, Charlie Kirk was one of those points of no return. It's obviously we're not going back to the country that we had. It is a new country, and another ICE shooting, it's going to move us potentially catastrophically close to conflict. Robert, thanks for standing by for all that. All right, anything else you got to cover on this slide?
Yeah, so that plan for DHS to expand their organic deportation flight capacity is underway. We reported on it a couple months ago. Daedalus Aviation got a contract to provide Boeing 737s to DHS. They, according to FAA data, have purchased 4 of those planes so far. DHS Assistant Secretary Tricia McLaughlin confirmed that they have acquired this aircraft to support deportation operations. Interestingly, these planes were previously owned by one of these contract carriers that DHS was using. They are moving, I think very likely moving to using their own planes owned by DHS because there have been activist attempts to disrupt those deportation operations, and they were tracking those flights.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, I noticed that as well. There's an airline called Avelo. I think it's called Avelo. And they were doing a lot of these deportation flights, and they had come under a public pressure campaign. Because the theory goes, well, if you stop Avelo, if you get Avelo to withdraw their cooperation with ICE, then ICE is left without any airplanes for deportation. And so that's one thing that DHS actually has gotten in front of, is getting their own deportation planes, due to that potential risk. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Let me we do have some questions that we'll get to. I just want to point out Ben's comment here. Mike's instinct on this has been pretty predictive. Well, A, I appreciate that. B, listen, I run a company that does intelligence on this stuff. It is in my economic interest to tell you the world is ending and you have to come and be a subscriber and listen to what we say every day. That's not what I've done, obviously historically. I'm pretty even keel. I take a non-passionate interest in this stuff. I mean, I obviously have my passions, but when it comes to actually analyzing the situation, most of the time I'm not freaked out, and I will tell you, you don't have to worry about this. This is a non-issue. This is gonna disappear in a week, whatever that issue is, if it's a non-issue. And we go back to like 2019. In November 2019, I wrote a report about, hey, there's a powder keg just waiting to explode. And then roughly 6 months later, we get George Floyd and stuff kicks off in 2020. If I'm not worried about something, I will tell you I'm not worried about it. If I tell you that I am worried about something, you should pay attention to it. And definitely over the past month, 3 months, we are definitely moving towards, Mike's a lot more concerned about this now. So we'll see. And maybe, nothing ever happens, bros. Maybe they're right about this. But we'll see. But let me just remind you, we do have these 10 to 12,000 ICE agents being pushed through the pipeline and in the process of being deployed around the country. In March, these indivisible groups, first of all these groups, they have not done a lot of protests until Renee Good. No, like big national days of action from this group. But they've spent the winter training and organizing in anticipation, in the buildup for what I've been calling this tongue-in-cheek, the spring offensive that was supposed to kick off in March. And it got a little accelerated there due to the shooting. But still, my point is the ICE deployments are going to coincide with the March, the spring offensive by these activists. And remember, we are moving. I told you all last year, we're moving from the protest phase this year, right now. moving from the protest phase to the organized resistance phase, which is going to be a lot more disruptive. As a matter of fact, there was an Axios article posted just a couple days ago that Robert and Jared covered. Robert covered it, called Trump Resistance 2.0 Pivots to Disruption. And I was telling you exactly they were going to do that 6 months ago. I said, look, it's going to come in by the middle of 2026. They are going to escalate into the organized resistance phase of this 3-phase. It's really color revolution movement, with color revolution being the culminating event if it's required in 2028. It remains available as a course of action or potential course of action. So these things are happening this spring and summer, and they're all happening at the same time. Buildup of ICE, the buildup to the left, not just reigniting protests, but pushing a lot of these protesters into higher risk actions like direct action, actual intervention. And we have seen this in low levels across, not just Minneapolis, but in Charlotte, in Chicago, in New York, in Los Angeles, and Portland, and Seattle, and obviously. So these two, I wouldn't necessarily call them mega trends, but they are major trends. These two trends are pointed at each other, and things are going to ramp up this spring and summer. That's what I'm saying. So with that, just if I start telling you something is important, it is 100% important. And thanks for that, Ben. All right, with that, Jared, let's go ahead and tee up some good questions, please. Can we charge the gun control groups with conspiracy against rights? Well, Robert, there has been that talk about national reciprocal carry and some efforts there. I don't know. Is this it doesn't seem like this is going to happen, but what's your perspective?
Yeah, I think that's unlikely. But the Trump administration could theoretically do this. I mean, the Biden administration used conspiracy against rights pretty liberally during a lot of these prosecutions for January 6th. Douglas Mackey, Trump officials after 2021. I don't think the Trump administration is likely to do that on this scale. Honestly, I think the Trump administration views gun control groups as just not a concern compared to these anti-ICE rapid response groups and some of these national level Trump resistance organizations.
Mm-hmm. All right, sure seems to be the case. And I think DOJ has their hands full anyway. All right, moving on. Weather affecting power is high on my area study. Yeah, guys, as always, it's like we don't even mention this stuff anymore. But yeah, ice on power lines is a recipe for you losing power. So if you have not if you don't have your battery banks charged, or you don't have your little whatever goal zero, whatever the things are called, charged, obviously do that. Next question, Jared. All right. To what extent is the Board of Peace emerging as a genuine U.S.-led alternative to the UN? I don't know, Jared. We kind of covered this a little bit earlier. You seem to say it's not a genuine alternative, but it seems like it's part of this. It's part of multipolarity. The United States trying to build. We go back to grand strategy from John Boyd, and it's about connecting yourself to as many power centers as possible while simultaneously disconnecting your opponent from as many power centers as possible. And it seems to me like Trump is trying to build a power center to connect the U.S. to.
Yeah, that's a very good read. But actually, it's an excellent read. I like you said, I do not think it's a direct competitor to the United Nations per se. It certainly is an overlap. I think it is going to be what's the word I'm looking for? A consensus building mechanism. And also frankly, they are with the exclusionary nature of it and the fact that they are saying we intend to be an organization of action as opposed to what the United Nations is, which is largely just strongly worded letters. I do think they are going to look for building legitimacy to compete in that arena by actually achieving their goals. I mean, to the extent that the Israel-Gaza conflict can be resolved, they do seem to at least be on the path.
Mm. All right. Thanks for that. Yeah, let's move on from Board of Peace. I do want to say something here. It's this someone Conquest says it's the same to see censorship even here. Guys, YouTube auto censors some comments. If you say anything violent in the chat, it's going to get deleted, obviously. Or if people are disruptive, or if people are too much of a distraction, yeah, we'll take care of the chat. But also realize, if you put something in the chat, YouTube may just delete it. They delete comments and stuff all the time. Like, I'll go back to the videos and say, 53 comments. And you go back in there's definitely not 53 comments, because YouTube auto deletes them. We have no control over that whatsoever. So just keep that in mind. All right. Jared, next question. Regarding the degradation of the judicial system, what do you see moving forward? There's so many states now that are visibly or actively in full rebellion against federal government. I wouldn't necessarily say they're in full rebellion, but they're definitely resisting federal authority. Yet they still want money from the feds. What do you see as the next steps? Well, Robert, it's funny that Bad Wabbits mentions that, because the Trump administration, haven't they either threatened or gone through? Oh yeah, in Minnesota, didn't they remove all the SNAP, or threaten to remove the SNAP funding due to the high levels of fraud?
Yeah, and they've done this for multiple different programs, and they have sent investigators for basically everything: the federal child care subsidies, SNAP, unemployment insurance fraud. They've also threatened to do this for multiple states, but a lot of these district courts continue to step in and say, well, you're not allowed to do this, despite whatever fraud, evidence of fraud.
Mm-hmm. And then, in terms of the administration's recourse to these, really, they're activist judges in some cases. We've already covered there's not going to be any kind of recall or impeachment against these judges, not from Congress, other than maybe voting in the next 2 or 4 year election cycles. There's probably not a lot of things that the people can do against these judges. Maybe, obviously organize some kind of pressure campaign. But in terms of what the Trump administration is able to do, they seem pretty limited.
Yeah, it's basically hoping to win at the circuit court of the appeals level, or the Supreme Court, which they have been more successful than not at getting wins at the higher level courts. What's really standing in the Trump administration's way, and this is also for the U.S. attorney problem, where they can't appoint U.S. attorneys in certain states, certain key states, is that the blue slip process in the Senate, which is just a rule that the Senate adopted. It allows, if the Trump administration wants to nominate a judge or a U.S. attorney in a blue state like Virginia, then the senators from that state can basically veto any of those nominations at the committee level. There's been talk in the Senate about getting rid of that. There are some key Republicans that are against getting rid of that, because they think that when a Democrat comes into office, well, now they're going to push through their own judges in red states. There's also, I think Mike Johnson mentioned yesterday or the day before that he's open to impeaching these judges, but I don't think that really matters, because they're not going to get a conviction in the Senate to remove any of these judges. So there is some talk among Republicans of actually impeaching the judges. I just don't think it's going to go anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Somewhat related topic, looking ahead to potentially Project 2029, which is this Democrat version of Project 2025. They're talking about stacking the courts and DC statehood and Puerto Rican statehood and trying to flip the Senate and, et cetera. Roman Helmet Guy over on X, by the way, he's a good follow, but he posted something that I thought was very astute yesterday. He said, in so many words, congressional Republicans should try to pass a law that cements the Supreme Court at 9 justices. And because right now there's nothing in our Constitution that says how many justices the Supreme Court should have, correct? So Correct. They said if you're concerned about Democrats expanding and stacking the Supreme Court when they come back into power, then go ahead and pass a law and make 9 justices federal law. And if Democrats support it, then great. If they don't support it, that's a clear indication they're going to expand and stack the court. Which again, this is like changing. One of the problems is so many rules have been changed, and there's some that Joshua Steinman first, or at least that I saw, first anyone talked about. Game theoretic defection. And Robert, if you and I were playing chess and you were obeying the rules and I was making new rules as I go along because I got myself into a bad position, I just said, now this piece can move anywhere it wants on the board. It can teleport anywhere it wants on the board, just radically changing the rules. Eventually, you're going to get tired of playing this game with me and you're going to quit. And this is, it seems like expanding and stacking the court is one of those things that could trigger game theoretic defection, or we just say, we're no longer playing by the same rules. We're going to stop playing this game. And so it's another reason I look at this and I just say, I think we are getting closer and closer to something like this finally happening. At any rate, any opinions on that, Robert?
Yeah, I think a lot of the resistance that exists within the Republican Party against Trump is the faction of establishment Republicans that think there is a return to the pre-2016 politics. That's what the Bush family coming out and saying they're going to take control of the Republican Party was about, is signaling a return to pre-MAGA politics. I just don't think that's realistic. I think it's clear by what Democrats did in Virginia. They ran on a moderate kitchen table issues campaign. Abigail Spanberger did, and then immediately started implementing their wish list, their Project 2029 wish list. I think it should be clear to Republicans, and I think for some of them it is, that there is not a return to that pre-2016 politics, but there are still some, especially older Republicans like Grassley in Iowa, who believe that they can stave off or return to that by not creating incentives for Democrats to implement Project 2029. I don't think they're taking that threat seriously, but every Democrat is effectively saying this at this point. And I think that is a good idea. You're basically by doing that, I think he specifically said, propose an amendment to the Constitution to cement that, because it is simple legislation that determines the size of the court. And it is a the filibuster, the legislative filibuster in the Senate is just a Senate procedural rule that could be changed. By doing that, you're basically forcing them to acknowledge publicly that they don't want that, and giving legitimacy to the push to eliminate the legislative filibuster, and then potentially for Trump to stack the court. I think that would be a very smart move by the Trump administration and those Republicans who are aware of the idea of Project 2029.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I will say time is running out. It is of the essence. All right. We still do have some questions, and listen, I'm sorry we're not going to be able to get through all of them. We have up this afternoon. I got my Friday economic early warning report coming out. I got to jump on that this morning and get that done for members. Listen, we have one more thing to do over on this website, and we will on Monday we'll have a link for members to move over to the new website and help us beta test it. We only need maybe like 20 or 50 of you, so we'll just take the first 20 or 50 that jump over and get some feedback and start pushing our information through there and make sure everything functions. And listen, there's a very, very important reason why we are doing this. Essentially, we function as what we would call the G2 or the C2 or the J2 or whatever. Okay, so that is the intelligence, basically national level intelligence in our case. What we're trying to do is get a handle on the operational level of these protests. I'm convinced that what we're looking at broadly, the color revolution movement, whether or not they get to that final third phase of executing a color revolution, the culminating phase of this whole thing, really depends on the election outcome. If a Democrat gets elected in November 2028, there's no need for a color revolution. If they can credibly challenge the election results, if a MAGA candidate wins, there's a good chance we will see one. That's what they're building right now. If or when that happens, and also in the lead up here, what I would really like to build is a national level picture of not just what this looks like in DC, but what this looks like regionally and then more locally. And we would love to have early warning members help us develop that picture by providing us with local open source intelligence. And those reports and that information is going to go into an assessment. Those assessments will be added up to look at the bigger operational level picture to authoritatively say we're on a scale of 1 to 10. How close are we? 10 being whatever 10 is going to be, 1 being whatever 1 is. But the whole point of this is to develop early warning about the potential for conflict or some kind of national level crisis or catastrophe that can be predicted. That's what we're trying to accomplish with this new early warning platform. Not only give you the tools that you need to maintain whatever interests you, maintain situational awareness on whatever you care about globally or locally, but also provide you with the intelligence, the early warning intelligence of what we talked about on the show, which is that we are moving from orange to red, if you want to use a color code. And we are potentially one trigger event away from being locked into potentially a multi-year, maybe multi-decade, violent, low-intensity conflict. Again, I'm not talking about 1861 or Russia, Ukraine. It's not going to, very unlikely to be a conventional war, at least not in the interim. I am far more concerned about this actually turning into something worse than what we saw in 2020. So with that, Monday, I'll send out the link to everyone, and we'd love to have your input. Let's get people involved and actually start producing some actual early warning intelligence for you on the local level. That's something we can do on the national level. Our team here, that's what we do on the global and national level. We want to push these tools and processes down to you at the local level so that you can look and make educated guesses or arrive at informed conclusions about how your own situation is shaping up. So everyone, with that, we appreciate your support and have a great rest of your Friday, a great weekend. Stay warm out there. Go get prepared. And for this ice storm, if you're going to be affected, while we'll hunker down. And we'll be back in your inbox on Monday, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.